Good morning, everyone. For those who don't know me, my name is Helena Nan. I'm the Executive Director with the Greater New York Chamber of Commerce. And it's such a gorgeous day out. Happy, happy, happy September. We have a lot going on here at the Greater New York Chamber of Commerce. And the way to start off September is this very, very informative webinar on how to legally franchise your business format to expand outlets of your business. And who, as a better speaker and the person that has all this information is David Ramsey from Kaufman, Gilden, and Robbins LLP. So what he's going to do is do the presentation, and if you have any questions, put it in the chat, and we'll do a Q&A afterwards. So right now, this is being recorded. It will be on Chamber TV. And I am going to turn it over to David. This is, David, this is our first time that we're doing a topic of this specific about legally franchised. We're a huge supporter of the International Franchise Expo that goes on at the Jacob Javits Center. And especially during COVID, a lot of people pivoted and bought franchises, or they started their own company. So this is going to be very, very informative. So take it away, and everyone put your questions in the chat, and we'll start with David. Thank you again, David.
Sure. Thanks very much. Good morning, Helena, and good morning, everyone. Happy to talk about this issue. Just to tell you a little bit about myself. After graduating from Harvard Law School, I was a general corporate transactional attorney for about 10 years. And then for the last 8.5 years or so, I've been a franchise lawyer, which is a niche area, a specific area with its own regulations and laws nationwide and in New York State about franchising. And so I help people become franchisors primarily. I also sometimes help people, advise people who are franchisees. And I'll get into what the difference is between those two things. But for those of you listening, whether you yourself are an independent business owner or your clients or customers are independent business owners, if they have a successful business model of any sort, they should be interested, at least in the topic of franchising, and they're likely to come across this subject, and you're likely to come across it. It's not for everyone, but it can be, and it is a proven for decades and decades now, method of expanding your business without having to put up the capital for each new outlet. That is, by letting others have their own independent businesses, using your brand, using your system, and with your oversight and monitoring of what they're doing. So that's what franchising is in a nutshell. I'm going to go through this. I'm going to talk for about 35, 40 minutes and then leave it open for questions. So, if you have a question, please feel free to jot it down and ask it at the end. I want to be able to answer your specific concerns and your specific questions. This is very much an overview. There's no way I can get into the details of franchise law, which is a very nuanced area of the law in this short seminar, but it's to give you a flavor of it, to give you a sense of what it entails if you or someone you know is interested in franchising. Okay, so with that said, first of all, what is franchising? So there's a little diagram here with perhaps the most simplistic view of what it is. But essentially, if you're doing the following three things, you are franchising, and you're subject to franchise law that you need to follow. Otherwise, there are significant penalties. So if you are licensing a mark, a trademark, a service mark, something like that, your brand that you've developed or that you have the rights to someone else, that's one element. That someone else is the franchisee and you'd be the franchisor. Now, just a trademark license in itself is not a franchise. It has to meet all of the elements. Secondly, if you have a system that goes with that mark, it's not just that someone can say pay you to use your mark. They have to follow your system, whether it's your system for operating a certain restaurant brand, or your system for a certain daycare brand, or your system for a hotel, or your system for a certain entertainment venue. If they're following your system, sometimes called a marketing plan, in other states, it's called a community of interest. In some states, it goes by different names, but basically, if they have to follow your system, that's the second element. Suppose you have like an operating manual, something like that. There's a system right there. And then thirdly, if they're paying you a fee for the privilege of using your brand and your system, those three things together constitute a franchise. Now, there are nuances to all these definitions of mark, system, and fee, but essentially those are the three elements. I should say that New York State, which has its own franchise law, in addition to the federal franchise law that applies across the country, in New York State, only two of these elements need to be met, not three. Either a mark and a system, that's the first element, so a mark or a system, that's the first element, and a fee. So it's a broader definition. So it's easier to get tripped up, and some people do get tripped up into the so-called accidental franchise, where they don't even know that they're franchising. They don't even know that they're supposed to be following franchise law. And they do it for years and years, and sometimes people get in trouble for that. So again, that is a kind of a nuanced area. There's a lot of details into that, but if you think that might apply to you, I'm also happy to speak with you on the side about that kind of subject. So that's what franchising is. Basically, you as the franchisor are providing your mark and your system to your franchisees who are independent business owners, and they're paying you for that. What they pay you could be, usually, it varies widely across systems, but it's typically an initial franchise fee of some sort, which is typically in the tens of thousands of dollars, sometimes more than that, sometimes less than that. It really depends. They're typically also paying you a royalty. That is, on every dollar they earn, it's usually a percentage, say 3%, 4%, 5%, 6%. Again, varies by the system, sometimes much higher than that, sometimes much lower. But they're paying you a royalty on every dollar that they earn for the privilege of using your system and mark. And then there could be other fees, and that depends on what you want to do, how you want to work your system. Some franchisors run the marketing or most of the marketing for their entire system, all networks, whether they own the brand, the outlets, or their franchisees own the outlets. And they collect an advertising fee for that, sometimes known as a brand fee. Some franchisors collect a technology fee. And there can be other fees as well. But essentially, the franchisees are paying you money as the franchisor, perhaps on a monthly or a weekly basis, on an ongoing basis. And you have a franchise agreement with them where you agree to provide your system and your mark to them as it evolves over time. And franchise agreements, which are a commercial contract, are typically 10 years in length, but they can be 20 years, they can be 5 years, 15 years. That also is up to you. So if you want to franchise, there are many decisions you need to make about how you want to do it, what all the terms of your particular franchise will be. And typically people work with an attorney, although you're not legally required to, but it's advisable to work with an attorney to work through all these things, come up with your system. Some people also hire business consultants to help them with this, come up with your manual or your brand standards in writing, and start franchising, which involves some legal steps as well before you can do it, before you can sell franchises. So moving on, here are some examples of franchises that were started in the greater New York area. Some of them are everyday names that everyone has heard of, such as TGI Fridays or Sbarro. Both started in New York. Bear Burger started just about 15 years ago, also in New York. There are hundreds, probably thousands of franchise brands that were started in the US, which is probably the biggest country in the world in terms of franchising, but especially in New York. It's a very vibrant economic engine from which a lot of franchises have developed. And, you know, it's not just restaurants, by the way. Those first three I mentioned are restaurants, but there's franchising in all areas. You know, I mentioned here Fred Astaire Dance Studios, which has actually been around since the 1950s as a franchise, started in New York. Now it's around the country and around the world, in fact. Weichert is an example of a realtor's brokerage agency, and there are many brokerages, real estate brokerages that are franchised, actually, which is based in New Jersey. Patsy's Pizzeria, based in Harlem. Golf Cave, also based in New Jersey. That's a relatively new brand of the indoor golf simulator franchise of which there are a bunch at this point, different franchise brands, and that's based in New Jersey and is growing pretty rapidly. So just to give you a flavor of the kinds of companies that can be franchises. So what is the law of franchising? What do you have to do legally? So first of all, just a point about where franchise laws came from and when they started. In the US, most of the franchise laws were passed in the 1970s to early 1980s. And it started with California. Various other states after that passed their own franchise laws. A total of 14 or 15 states have their own franchise laws at this point. And the US Federal Trade Commission adopted what it calls the franchise rule. So that's federal franchise law, applies throughout the US and its territories and possessions, such as Puerto Rico and Virgin Islands, Guam, etc. So the Federal Trade Commission's franchise rule is just that. It's a rule. You have to follow it. There's nothing you need to report to the feds, to the federal government about what you're doing or anything you have to file with them in particular. That's where the states come in with their own franchise laws, which may not be exactly the same as the federal law. They have to be at least as restrictive as that, but some of them are more restrictive than the federal law. And why did all these states pass franchise laws? The reason being that there used to be a good amount of fraud in the franchise area. Not only in New York, but across the country. I'm talking about the 40s, 50s, 60s. And there were various exposés in the news media about it, where fake franchisors, essentially, who didn't really have a system, who didn't really have a number of successful outlets, would pretend that they did and sell franchises or so-called franchises to unwitting moms and pops and collect a franchise fee, their initial franchise fee, and essentially tell them that we'll be in touch with your franchise manual and we'll be in touch with how you're going to set up your franchise, and then would disappear and go to the next town or the next state and do the same thing. Now, these days, with the internet and various other changes in society and technology, that sort of thing is harder to pull off. But also, the franchise laws have made it much harder to pull off because before you can sell a franchise in these various states and under federal law, you need to provide a franchise disclosure document to any prospective franchisee, which is a lengthy document. It's where you have to provide various pieces of information about yourself and what you're doing and what your system is, how it works, etc., and your company and its financials. And you also have to follow various franchise relationship laws. So the relationship laws are in some states, not all, and not even all of the 14 or 15 states that have their own franchise laws, but the relationship laws are about essentially once you're in a franchise, making sure that you as the franchisor treat the franchisee with some basic standards of fairness. So terminating them or not renewing their franchise or discrimination or things, not letting them organize among themselves. Different franchise relationships laws in different states cover different things, but there are those relationship laws as well. So this framework of franchise law is what governs franchising, is what you have to follow. And in various states, not all of them, but in most of the 14 or 15 franchise registration states, you not only have to provide this franchise disclosure document before you sell any franchise, you have to first register it with the state. And in some of those states, you have to wait for the state to approve it, or not approve, but consent to accepting it. You have to wait for them to accept your registration filing and make it effective. And New York is one of those states. This can take a while, especially if you're just getting started. If they've never seen you before, you have no track record of franchising. So this is why it's advisable to get a franchise attorney to assist you, who can guide you through that process, represent you in front of the regulators, the state franchise regulators, help you prepare a franchise disclosure document that's compliant with law, with franchise laws, and file it. And sometimes this involves a bunch of back and forth, especially the first time around with the state franchise regulators, until they may have comments, They may, in that way, it's similar to securities filing in the sense of you need to disclose all material facts about your franchise offering. Just like when you're offering securities in your company, say stock, you have to disclose all material facts about the stock offering. In that sense, it's the same in franchising. So some states have a merit review, others have an annual notice filing, and others have a single notice filing. I say here, New York State is one of these states. Actually, this should be under the merit review in the sense that New York has to not only, you don't just file annually with them, but the New York State Attorney General's office, which is the office that regulates franchising in New York State, has to accept your filing. And that can take some time for them to review it, and they may have comments. And other states, it's just an annual notice, and other states, it's a single one-time notice. So in some states, like say in Nebraska, you want to franchise there, you want to sell a franchise of your brand in Nebraska, it's a one-time filing, it's a one-page filing, and you're done. So in other states, it's much more involved. So in a nutshell, that's the law of franchising. Of course, it gets more complicated, but that's it as a broad overview. So what are these states that have their registration and disclosure laws where you have to file something with the state? And most of the time, most of the states, you have to wait for them to accept it. It's these states listed here. A lot of these states are among the most populous states of the US. So if you want to franchise, and New York is of course on the list, if you want to franchise, and it's likely that you're going to come across these regulations that you'll have to follow. Now, there are exemptions depending on your particular scenario. For example, the size of your company, the net worth of your company, and your experience, and the nature of the franchise you're offering. There are situations where you don't have to file with the state, or all you have to file is an exemption rather than actually waiting for them to review and accept your franchise disclosure document. But in most cases, for a startup franchisor, you have to do a registration filing with these states. All right, so moving on. So what is that filing? And basically, what is this franchise disclosure document that you need to create in order to offer and sell franchises of your brand to independent business owners for them to operate units of your brand? Essentially, it's 23 items. Those 23 items include, just to give you a flavor of it, who are you as the franchisor? What state were you formed? Where's your headquarters? How do we contact you? Do you really own a trademark? Have you registered it federally? What's the registration number? What exactly is the mark? What are all the marks you've registered? What fees do you charge? Do you charge them uniformly, or do you negotiate different fees with different people? What is the total initial estimated investment that a franchisee is going to have to make? And what's a breakdown of that initial investment? What are the initial fees that they're going to have to pay? What are the ongoing fees that they're going to have to pay? How do you assist them exactly? What do you do for them, for the franchisee? What do you expect of them? For example, do you expect them to personally guarantee the owner, if they have a franchise entity, say a corporation or an LLC that's going to own their unit, do you require the owners to personally guarantee all of the obligations to you of that franchisee entity? In most cases, franchisors do require that. But the franchise disclosure document is where you would explain all of these things. And so it's a pretty detailed document. You also need to provide, in most cases, audited financial statements of yourself as the franchisor. Typically, as a franchisor, you'll create an entity to serve as your franchisor entity. So that entails a cost as well. So it's important to understand, if you're considering franchising, that there are compliance costs. For example, getting those audited financial statements. And you're going to need audited financial statements each year and have to refile that with the state agencies, as well as any changes to your franchise offering with state agencies at a minimum. So there are costs involved, but the idea is that franchising can be a very lucrative business if it's launched carefully and correctly. You also will need to take into consideration internally, as part of your analysis, what the economics of a franchisee will be, what their bottom line is going to be, how it's going to work. For them, if they're not making money, you won't have a sustainable franchise system. So there's a lot of analysis that goes into that. And you want to create pro formas, at least internally for yourself, to understand what a franchisee's outlook is going to look like. Um, Okay, now their disclosure timing requirements. Another key part, and this trips a lot of people up with selling franchises, is that in most states, you need to give 14 days. You need to give them the disclosure document, franchise disclosure document, get a signed receipt from them or when they received it, and then wait 14 days before you enter into a franchise with them. That is before you sign any franchise agreement with them and before you accept any money from them for the franchise. So that 14-day cooling off period, so to speak, which is common in other sort of consumer protection areas of the law, is so that they have time to review the franchise disclosure document, perhaps consult with an attorney or accountant or business advisor of their own, and look into it, think about it, so that it's not hastily jumped into. In New York State, it's 10 days from the first meeting or substantive discussion that you have with the prospective franchisee. So again, this is one way in which New York is unusual in that it's more restrictive than other states. But in most states, under the federal law and under the state franchise laws, it's 14 days you have to wait. So all of these things you need to build into your practices if you become a franchisor and pay attention. And it's advisable to go through a training. There are various companies that provide franchise legal compliance training, law firms such as my own that provide that to make sure you and your staff who will be selling franchises are doing it the right way. So it's important to note that there are significant penalties if you don't comply with franchise laws, with these things I'm describing. Okay, so first of all, if you don't comply, there's for a certain period of time or years, the franchisee can sue for rescission of the franchise agreement, the legally binding contract that you enter into with them. They can sue to get out of it and for you to compensate them for all their costs and expenses that they incurred to basically put them in the position they would be as if they had never entered into the contract. So for example, you don't give those 14 days, you don't wait those 14 days, or you don't provide a franchise disclosure document, or your franchise disclosure document is not properly registered with the state. Any of those things can trigger a rescission situation. So there's that. You also would have to pay for their attorney's fees in some cases if it's willful. That depends on state law. In some states, there are also punitive damages. For example, under New York State's Franchise Sales Act, if you willfully violate these requirements, you'll be subject to punitive damages and potentially even criminal liability. So there are significant concerns. So both the franchisee can sue you, private lawsuits, and government agencies tasked with enforcing franchise laws can sue you. So you can be in significant trouble for not following franchise laws. But if you follow them, and most people do follow them, it's a very successful business model. In terms of who can be held liable, it's important to note that for purposes of franchise law, it's not just your entity. So you can't be shielded in the way you can in various other areas by creating a corporation or an LLC. As far as franchise law obligations goes, registration and disclosure requirements, from those legal liabilities, you can't be shielded just by having an entity. You personally, the owners and the principals, will be liable. So it's one area in which franchise law is very stern, very serious. So it's important to take it seriously. All right, so next is the subject of financial performance representations. So this is probably the area of franchise law about doing franchising right that most trips people up, and it's the subject of most litigation. Financial performance representations, what are they? Essentially, they are disclosures that you make to prospective franchisees before they decide to buy one of your franchises about how much they're going to make. Okay, that's a simplification, but essentially, how much revenue they're going to bring in or how much their profit is going to be, um, or even providing a pro forma to a franchisee, like a business plan, where you lay out for them, or even you even approve of their own pro forma or business plan, or tell them, yeah, that looks right. All of those things immediately become your representations for legal purposes, and they will be Exhibit A if a franchisee becomes disgruntled down the line and wants out and wants to cancel their franchise agreement early, or even wants to sue you for damages. They'll say, you told me I was going to make this much money and I didn't. So you want to be careful with that. The cardinal rule with financial performance representations is that if you want to make any, and you can, for example, you can say, look, we have these businesses already, either our corporate owned businesses, or if you have franchises already, our franchised businesses. This is how they have performed, and you can choose exactly which performance numbers you want to give, although you shouldn't be cherry picking, and there are various rules and guidance around that. You can provide that, but it has to be in your franchise disclosure document. That's the general rule. So you can't be providing it just say on a napkin over dinner, writing down how much they're going to make, or in a PowerPoint presentation at a seminar or a expo, a franchise expo, if it's not in your franchise disclosure document. So that's the cardinal rule. But the other thing to consider is how to sell franchises without making financial performance representations. You're not required to. You don't have to tell franchisees, prospective franchisees, how much they're going to make, or even how much your existing units have made. That's not legally required, and you can choose not to. But if you don't, in your franchise disclosure document, you need to make sure your business people, your staff, are aware that they can't be making those representations to people on the side when they're trying to sell a franchise. And you want to be careful if you use franchise brokers that the brokers are not doing that either. And that's another thing where people oftentimes get tripped up. So essentially, that's in a nutshell, a very small nutshell, what financial performance representations are and why you need to be careful about them. You should also consider that in your FDD, your franchise disclosure document, there's going to be a required section where you list the names and the contact information of any franchisees you already have. So anyone you've already sold a franchise to who's operating a unit, an outlet, a center, a store of your brand, their contact information is going to be in your franchise disclosure document, which in those 14, 15 states, by the way, is a publicly filed document that anyone could get access to. And some states make it very easy online to get access to. So the point is that a prospective franchisee doesn't have to take your word for it, or doesn't necessarily have to get information only from you about financial performance. They can contact your existing franchisees and ask them whatever they want to ask them about your system, about how they like being in your system, part of your network of stores, chains, etc. So, just something to consider. I see that some people have asked some questions, such as, is it easier to start franchising in one state rather than multiple states? And I'll be happy to answer that. I'm going to get to that at the end. So, financial performance representations in a nutshell. Okay, I also just want to give an example, and then I'll start taking questions, frankly, from people. A recent example, this is from this year in the New York courts, of what not to do about a franchise law case. And if you think it's not an active area of law where they're not really policing it, that's not the case. They are. The New York Attorney General's office takes very seriously their Investor Protection Bureau, which is tasked with franchise law enforcement, takes it very seriously. So this case was about an ice cream store, the Delights brand ice cream franchisor. Now, in this case, it was actually a sub-franchisor. I'm not going to get into sub-franchising and what exactly that means, but for purposes of this analysis, it makes no difference. So they were an ice cream franchisor, in the New York tri-state area. They had the rights to sell this ice cream brand franchises in the New York tri-state area. They sold 3 franchises. All of the franchisees failed, didn't last more than a couple of years, maybe 2 or 3 years, just didn't make much money, which is fine. Your franchisees, I mean, it's not ideal. Of course, you want your franchisees to be successful, but the point is, it's not your obligation as a franchisor that they be successful. They're independent business owners. It's their obligation. Where the problem was, is not following franchise law. And that's where this franchisor got into significant trouble. They didn't provide any franchise disclosure document to these franchisees before selling them a franchise or after selling them a franchise. So the various disclosures that likely would have changed the mind, and these franchisees testified that it would have changed their mind. They wouldn't have invested in this franchise. The various disclosures that would be in a franchise disclosure document were not provided. Also, in this case, the franchisor was marking up the price for each gallon of ice cream that it sold. In this case, the franchisees had to buy the ice cream from the franchisor that it sold to the franchisees by $5 a gallon, a very significant markup. So it was buying the ice cream for $8 a gallon, and it was selling it to its franchisees for $13 a gallon. And so gallon after gallon, these franchisees are paying. Again, it's not necessarily a violation of franchise law to mark up, to make a profit off of supplying things to your franchisees. In fact, in many franchise systems, that's a key part of the franchise system, how the franchisor makes money. But what is a violation is not disclosing it. So that's one of the disclosure requirements in a franchise disclosure document. It's also quite simply a material fact that a franchisee should know, which is that you're making money off of them as a franchisor, not just from the fees they pay you, like the royalty or the initial franchise fee, et cetera, but also off of what you're supplying to them. So that, as well as rebates that you get from suppliers that they have to purchase from, or any kind of kickbacks or other payments, needs to be disclosed. And this is why it's a good idea, among other reasons, to get a franchise attorney to consult with when you're franchising. But they made no disclosure about that to the franchisees. They also, although they didn't provide an FDD, exaggerated the earnings of their own store. They had a store in Woodbury on Long Island, I believe, how much it was making. And they provided that information, that exaggerated information, to franchisees. And they provided what they called a business plan, which is essentially a pro forma predicting how much the franchisees would make based on exaggerated numbers. They provided that to the prospective franchisees about how much the prospective franchisees would earn. And that was actually based on another store in Florida. So arguably a very different market for ice cream than New York, which is seasonal, much more seasonal than Florida for ice cream. And each of these stores closed. The franchisees did not make much money or any money. And the court actually ordered that the franchise agreements be rescinded and that the franchisor make whole each of these franchisees, put them in the position they would have been if they had never invested in the franchise at all, including all the expenses that they incurred to open up their stores, to construct their stores, to design the stores, to buy the furniture, fixtures, and equipment, etc. And the extra ice cream markup per gallon to reimburse them for that. That didn't end up being a big part of the judgment in this case, but it could be in other franchise systems. Plus 6% interest. This is under the New York State Franchise Act, provides for 6% interest. Plus attorney's fees. So without even taking into account that interest and the attorney's fees, that has yet to be determined. The court ordered for that to be measured without even adding that up. It's over $800,000 that the franchisor was required to reimburse these former franchisees who had since closed. That's broken up between the 3. Added up, it's over $800,000. So that's just one recent example of how franchising can trip you up if you don't do it right. Most franchisors do it right, don't have a problem. But again, it's important to have a franchise attorney advise you on these kinds of things. So with that said, That's just a brief primer I wanted to give you on how franchising works. There are, of course, business considerations to take into account, and I'm happy to talk about those as well, such as how do you create a manual, how do you create brand standards. But at this point, I'd like to open it up for questions and see how I can help.
Wow.
So,
Lot of great
uh,
information there. So place your questions in there. You know what, not only for, David, for franchising, but that's what you're focusing on. Manuals are, there's a lot of emphasis on manuals now, correct?
yes, yeah, that's true. Absolutely. Mhm.
So I think that what you were saying with that about franchising, it gets into, the specifics on, what you need and what to supply everyone with.
Yeah.
Any questions? Oh, go ahead, David.
About manuals, that's a key area actually in just the last few months that both federally and in New York State, the regulators have been talking about, which is that the nature of a franchise manual is, you create a manual about how operating manuals, how to operate your day-to-day franchise. But there also might be some fees in there in the manual. And the nature of a manual is that it has to evolve over time. Every franchise or your system is changing day by day, month by month, year by year. You may change things about how your stores or how your brand is run, or even what trademarks someone has to use. So a manual has to be subject to change. But what you can't do is introduce new fees on franchisees that they didn't sign up for when they signed their franchise agreement. So there's a careful balance that has to be struck there in creating your manual. Okay.
There's a question, while planning to franchise your business, what are the recommended high-level steps, average time to complete full process, and estimated costs of a franchisor should plan for?
Okay, great question. So look, recommended high-level steps. The first thing I would do is actually create the basics of your manual, because going through that exercise, first of all, not only helps you as a business owner, it's good to put in writing your standard operating procedures anyway. Um, it may help you with dealing with your own staff. But it also helps you determine whether is this something that's going to be franchisable? Is it the kind of system that someone else can follow, and they don't have to be my employee? They can be an independent operator. Is it something that they can do in a separate location where I'm not there all the time to make sure they're following the manual? So that's a good idea to do. It also helps you, it will help you when you have to create the franchise disclosure document. So later on, when you engage, say, an attorney to help you draft that franchise disclosure document, there are various numbers you're going to need to have. They're gonna ask you 1,000 questions. I'm gonna ask you 1,000 questions. And if you go through that exercise of putting together your manual ahead of time, you'll be one step ahead of the game. In fact, you'll be 10 steps ahead of the game. It'll save you a lot of time. And how do you do that? I mean, even if you don't have a business consultant or someone who's done it before helping you, it's basically, if you're running your business, you know your business. Go around with a notepad from the start of the day to the end of the day and write down everything that you're doing, not only what you're doing, but everything you're coming into contact with. Like if you have a point of sale operating system, how much does that cost? Where did you get it from? What system do you use? What hardware is required? What software is required? What computer systems are required? What stereo system is required? What furniture, fixtures, equipment are required? And go through how much did it cost you to set up your outlets, right? All those things, having that lined up, create a big Excel spreadsheet for it. It'll help you. Okay, and then in terms of advisors and other costs. So look, you need to decide, first of all, where you want to offer franchises. For example, do you want to do it just in New York? Okay, then you need to think only about the laws in New York. Do you want to do it across the country? Okay, then there are various filings you'll have to do. So there are filing fees. If you wanted to do it across the country, currently, all of the filing fees for your first year of franchising add up to about $4,000. Because, each state that has franchise law charges a few $100s to file there. So there's that. then how much are you going to have to pay for attorneys? Well, if you choose to have attorneys, which is highly advisable, to help you with to get going. Initially, that's when most of the work is to set up your franchise documentation. It's going to be a few tens of thousands of dollars to set that up because it entails intensive time, attorney time and accountant time, because you're also going to need, or it's highly advisable in most cases, audited financial statements. So you'll need to budget that. Can I be more specific than that? I can, but it depends on your particular scenario. Like, how much, for example, my firm would charge or how much a different firm would charge, and how much work you need done will depend on your circumstances. But it will almost certainly involve a few tens of thousands of dollars upfront. After that, there's an annual maintenance and upkeeping fee, which is much, much less than that. Because you're only tweaking things here and there and doing update filings. It's the initial filings and the back and forth with the franchise regulators that cost the most. So I hope that's helpful. I'm happy to speak with whoever asked that question offline if they want to contact me in more detail. Oh, and in terms of how long it takes. Okay, well, there's an element of it that is out of control, out of our control or your control, because in states such as New York, where you have to file and wait for the examiners to read your franchise disclosure document, let you know if they have any comments. New York these days is not particularly comment intensive, which is good. But it could take a few weeks. It could take a couple of months. The reason being, it depends on what time of year you file. There is a renewal season in franchising. It's tied to the timing in franchise laws of when your audited financial statements are. But typically in spring, or I should say February through April, May, is the busiest time of year. The examiners, the regulators are inundated with filings by franchisors, especially renewal filings, but also new filings. And so it'll be slower then as compared to if you filed, say, now in early September, your initial filing. So there's that, and that depends state by state. But the good news is, if you're not only focused on New York, or only focused on those franchise registration states, the 14 or 15 of them, there's over 30 states where you can franchise pretty much immediately. As soon as your franchise disclosure document is complete, you don't have to file it with anyone, or it's a simple notice filing, a one-page notice filing, and you can start offering and selling franchises. So in most of the country, you can do it. It depends on how quickly you provide the information to your lawyer to create your franchise disclosure document, but maybe in a couple weeks, if you're very fast, in most of the country, you can start franchising. So I hope that gives you a sense of it. You want to go to the next question? So how should we do this, Elena? Should I just read them out loud, or you want to do? Okay. So let's see.
I think which which question, the easiest states to franchise in?
Yeah, I see. Is it easier to start franchising in one state? Patricia Warner asked. One state rather than multiple states, or is it better to focus on all chosen states at once? That's another great question. Look, there are pros and cons. If you know where upfront where you are going to offer and sell franchises in the near term, for example, if you know, we're just focused on New York right now, or we're just focused on the tri-state area, or we're just focused on the Midwest, or something like that, well, then if you have a plan for that, plan of growth, where you're really not even going to look at other states, or you have no plans to, then why apply everywhere at once? If you the downside of it is, if you get a hot prospect, say you have a successful brand, and someone from California hears about your brand and contacts you and really wants to invest in one of your franchises, but you haven't filed in California. Oh, okay, well, you're gonna need to file, wait, could take a couple months for the examiner to get back to you on your franchise disclosure document, especially if you've never filed it in California before. They're likely going to have comments that you'll have to respond to, wait again for them to accept your changes in response to their comments. So, and that person's got to wait on, you can't offer or sell the franchise until that is accepted in California. So, there's that downside, potential downside. So it depends. There's also the cost, but relative to the other costs, the cost of just filing with the state, the filing fee is a relatively small amount compared to the, business advisor costs and the time factor. So I hope that helps. Happy to speak about more specific situations on the side. Yeah, feel free to contact me.
Thank you for that. Is it easier? Okay, we did that.
Let's see.
Did you, I think you,
Okay, I think someone said, I am a small cleaning business owner. I'm looking to buy a cleaning franchise with platform. Can I take a look? Okay, seems like a very specific question. I'm not so much in the business of connecting people, sort of like a broker would do with franchises that fit their investment, or franchisees that fit their business. But there are franchise brokers, some more reputable than others. I should
yeah,
warn.
David, we have a couple of members that do that.
Okay,
So,
great.
and I think one or two people are on that, so they can, that person, not to cut you off,
No
David,
problem.
but if
Fine.
that person is looking for that, they can reach out to David or,
Yeah,
contact me because we have a couple of members that are specific for that.
great. Yeah, I would recommend that. But yeah, cleaning business, that's another area where there have been a number of successful franchise brands that have grown exponentially. And so, it's a proven pathway to grow in the cleaning business, particularly the franchise model. So yeah, I think it's good to think about that. Have you seen new business franchise a few years from start? I think what you mean is, do you have to be in your business for years and years and years, like, or decades before you can start franchising? And the answer is no. I've seen a lot of my clients are startup franchisors who have, 2 or 3 locations. So they've just been in their business maybe 3, 4, 5 years, and they're ready to start franchising. If you feel that you're ready, if you really know what it's like, not just to operate one outlet, but to operate more than one outlet, if you have experience more than just one time in starting up an outlet and what that involves, then you could be in a position to advise a franchisee, a third party, on how to do it. So it's a case by case thing. You need to ask yourself, am I in a position to do it? But lots of franchise brands have grown, huge in just the space of a few years. I mean, look at Bear Burger, one that I mentioned, that, in 2009 they were established. By 2015, 2016, they had dozens of locations. So, it can grow very quickly. I hope that's what your question was, and that I addressed it. If not, feel free to contact me. Um, let's see. Somebody's asking, what are the easiest states to franchise in addition to Nebraska? Uh, well, look, as I mentioned, there's over 30 states where there's nothing you need to file with any state. So from a legal perspective, there are lots and lots of states. In fact, the majority of states in the US where there's no particular obstacle or challenge other than your own initiative in terms of franchising. If you mean what are the states where franchising is growing the quickest, from what I've seen from reports, the Southeast and Midwest and Texas. So, for example, places like Florida, Texas, Ohio, um, have been growing a lot in recent years. Part of that has to do with the labor market, business-friendly regulations, tax regimes of different states that are not franchise specific, but just larger business questions about starting new businesses. But those are the areas where I've seen it grow the most. I should note that some of those areas, some of those states have very little franchise specific legal regulation. Why do I note that? Because it might mean that it's a little bit more of a wild, wild west environment, where you and your competition might not be as careful about disclosure and following franchise restrictions, franchise kind of guardrails that are in place in other states to make sure that there's maximum transparency and fairness. So, you know, a lot of the franchise litigation that you see, for example, for whatever reason, comes out of Florida. So, you know, there are not to say the other states don't have it. Certainly they do, but you know, it's important to be careful and to do it right. So again, I would just emphasize having a franchise attorney guide you. You might want to consider having a franchise business consultant, and there's a whole cottage industry around that, guide you. Make sure it's someone experienced in franchising, not just any attorney, not just any business consultant. Ask about how much experience they have, if you're delving into these waters. Let's see. Any other questions posed? Do you see any, Helena?
I'm looking and, oh, I don't know if you saw this one. This is the, down on a private one. Is there any cases of a CPA firms franchising nationwide? Did you do that
Oh,
one?
yeah. No, I hadn't seen that one. So, yes, there are. The short answer is yes. What's coming to my mind, and you know, there's thousands of franchise brands across so many industries that I don't necessarily have it off the top of my head, but I think Jackson Hewitt, or it's a name something like that, is a franchised brand because I've seen some litigation about that franchise brand. That's why I happen to know that name. But uh, I'm sure there are others as well.
I think. Any other questions? Well, David, thank you this was really, really informative. Quick question for you. And I know that we do a lot with webinars with the SBA, Small Business Administration, access to capital, and we talk about franchising, and also meet the lenders, things like that.
Yeah.
Is there different guidelines for for financial, for investing in franchises that is different than, for a small business? Is there any avenue for them to go to for access to capital, or is it the same route that an entrepreneur, starting a business goes through?
Great question. You know, franchising, the SBA, their lending programs for decades now have been lending to franchisees of lots of brands. And there's a lot of, the SBA is very familiar with franchising. And up until recently, they had what was called a franchise directory, which is the SBA would review franchisors' franchise disclosure documents in order to determine just a few questions about how they work their particular franchise and whether when you get an SBA loan as a franchisee wanting to open your own outlet, whether you need to sign a particular SBA addendum for franchising in addition to your franchise agreement to assure the SBA essentially that the franchisor doesn't really control you, that you are an independent small business, that you're not one and the same with the franchisor. And so that's why they wanted to look at franchise disclosure documents, see how it works, et cetera. And that the franchisor would have to sign that addendum as well. And lots of franchisors do that still, even though there's no longer a franchise directory per se of like vetted franchise brands that the SBA thinks are okay for lending. It used to be hundreds, if not thousands, of franchise brands on that list. Even though there's no directory anymore, it's still very much active that the SBA provides loans through local banks for franchising. So it's a great way that a lot of franchisees take advantage of to fund. And even some franchisors get loans from the SBA, but that's another story. So yeah, short answer is yes. Does that answer your question, Helena?
Yeah, because we, like I said, we do a lot of webinars with that to get more, to advise businesses how to, they need money. and to stay in business, and that drives the economy.
Absolutely. And especially during COVID, actually, the SBA played a huge role and actually made some changes to its what would otherwise be its rules in terms of franchise operations, franchise outlets during COVID, because there were some places, for example, pockets of the country or pockets of certain cities where, say, 7-Eleven, for example, which is a client of my firm, that where the only place for people to buy groceries or even get diapers or formula was the local 7-Eleven, and franchisees of 7-Eleven were having trouble staying open during COVID, or trouble surviving during COVID, the economic environment. And the SBA made certain changes to his lending program in light of that. So the SBA has been well aware of franchising for decades now and very cooperative. Yeah, it's definitely a great avenue for a franchisee to get funding.
Love it, love it, love it. Love this information. Okay, the last question is, what is the average cost to franchise?
Look, I mean, it's a great question, but the truth is
General
that it
question.
varies widely. There are franchises that are, well, first of all, it depends on what you mean by the average cost. So there's the average initial franchise fee or fees that you have to pay to the franchisor, but that's not by any means the cost, because then there's the initial investment that a franchisee has to make to build out their outlet, whatever type of outlet it is. For example, things like furniture, fixtures, equipment, rent to a landlord, getting a lease, construction, etc., signs. So that varies widely, and it depends on the nature of the franchise, how much equipment, how much build out is required for that particular kind of business. I've seen it range. I mean, it's typically somewhere in the hundreds of thousands to open up an outlet if you take into account all of those costs, a very small percentage of which is actually fees paid to the franchisor. Most of it is build out costs and rent and things like that. But there are franchises that cost millions to start a single franchise. It depends really on the size and scope of the business involved. Right.
Well, it's 11 o'clock right now. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us. David, thank you for this very informative webinar. Will be on Chamber TV. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to David. His contact information is right in front of us. Just coming up, FYI, for the Greater New York Chamber of Commerce, online networking next Tuesday at 10 o'clock. We are doing an in-person networking at Le Parc, which is like a community office spaces. That should be in-person networking. And then also September 24th, talk about businesses. We have all the local, city, state, federal agencies, small, medium-sized companies, and major corporations at our Business Expo, September 24th. Free to walk around, just RSVP at chamber.nyc. If you're interested in a table, this year it's really popular. I had to open up another room, which is a good thing. That means the economy is doing well. So we're really excited about that. Let me know about a table. And again, everyone, thank you so much for joining us. David, again, thank you so much for your time on this and what you do. We appreciate what you do. The Greater New York Chamber is here to help you grow your business. And that's what David Ramsey, partner from Kaufman, Gilden, and Robbins LLP does. So thank you again.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.